so we'll see.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Pedro. I'm a Deputy Director at CEBRI for External Affairs. And I'm very happy to have you all here, both in person and online, for this very interesting panel that we've managed to put together. Today, we're going to have a discussion about what Brazil looks like before the eyes of the United States. And this is one of the many initiatives that our North America and United States program organizes here at CEBRI. We have over 14 thematic programs. This is one of them, one of the most thriving ones. And in order to have that discussion today, we're going to have three very distinguished guests, actually two very distinguished guests, and one of our very own who will lead the discussion. So I'll make one introduction, which is Professor Feliciano Guimarães, who's also online. He's the academic director of the Brazilian Center for International Relations, and he will be, moderating the questions, and also after the Q&A section that'll take place here, either in person or online. So thank you again for being here, and over to you, Feliciano. Thank you also for hailing from São Paulo.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. Thank you, Brian, Fernanda. This is, as Pedro mentioned, is one of the initiatives from our North America Center. CEBRI has 14 centers, from regional centers to thematic centers, such as human rights and Africa, Europe, and North America. And this, as Pedro mentioned, is a very interesting subject for us. The title is Brazil in the Eyes of the United States. And we have here two very distinguished people that can give us an overview of this perception. First is Brian Winter, who is the editor-in-chief of the America's Quarterly magazine and vice president of American Society of the Americans. He worked for Reuters for many years in Brazil. He covered politics and economics in virtually every country in the region and lived in São Paulo, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City. Brian is the author and co-author of 4 books about Latin America, including Why Soccer Matters, a New York Times bestseller that he wrote with Brazilian soccer legend Pelé. He also co-authored with President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, The Accidental President of Brazil, No Lost Causes with President Álvaro Uribe, and Long After Midnight, a memoir about his time in Argentina. Brian Winter is a colleague of CEBRI, a very good friend of ours, and we have been cooperating with America's Quarterly for quite some time. I'm the editor-in-chief of the CEBRI Journal. We have exchanged articles between CEBRI Journal and America's Quarterly, so it's a great pleasure to have Brian here with us. And we also have our dear fellow Professor Fernanda Magnotta. She's an expert in U.S. politics and a researcher interested in U.S.-China relationship. She's the current coordinator of the undergrad international relations program at the Armando Álvares Penteado Foundation here in São Paulo. She's in Rio now with us. She's also a columnist of international affairs for the probably the biggest Brazilian website, the UOL website, and then she always talks regularly at CBN radio station, also Brazil's biggest radio station, and she's always there talking about international relations. Magnotta is also a senior fellow at the North American program at the Brazilian Center of International Relations, and the author of the book Ideas Matter: North American Exceptionalism, the Dawn of the Superpower, and published in 2016. She holds a PhD and a master degree from the Santiago Dantas program, where I got my master's degrees from. And so it's a pleasure to see another colleague from Santiago Dantas talking about international relations to a broader audience. So what are the views of Americans, how Americans perceive Brazil? This is a very important question for our foreign policy. I was just this morning giving an interview to a couple of Chinese diplomats, and one of the questions that they made was like, do Brazilians care what the Chinese think about themselves, about Brazilians? And I say, I think Brazilians care about what the Chinese think about ourselves, but what the Brazilians really care is what Americans and Europeans think about Brazilians. So the source of prestige and international recognition and status for Brazilians is not yet in China or India, but is still in the United States and Europe. So the way the Americans perceive ourselves is something very, very important to us. I've been working for many years with public opinion surveys in Brazil. And when we question Brazilians about how they perceive the United States, and that's the reverse of the question here, Brazilians are probably the Latin Americans who perceive the Americans with the most positive view. I'm not sure there is a change here. I don't think I see you. Can you see me?
Yeah, it's all right. Go ahead.
Okay, so for some reason I don't see you anymore. So yeah, so Brazilians tend to see Americans very positively. And we compare, we make the same questions in 9 different Latin American countries, and Brazilians are the ones that perceive Americans more positively the most, right? Much better than the Mexicans, Argentinians, and Bolivians, Peruvians, and Ecuadorians. So there is something there about Brazilian people who really like the United States in every aspect. So, but how do Americans perceive Brazil? This is a $1 million question. So we have two good people here to discuss this with us. So Brian, I give you the word back to you. I'm looking forward to hear your comments. Thank you very much for being here with us again.
Thank you very much, Feliciano. Thank you to all of you for being here. Vou falar só rapidamente em português. Como o Feliciano mencionou, eu morei 5 anos no Brasil, em São Paulo. Eu falo português com sotaque do interior de São Paulo. Ninguém sabe exatamente por quê. E talvez um pouco por isso decidimos fazer o evento hoje em inglês. Listen, thank you again, and what a pleasure it is to be on a panel with you, Fernanda. Pedro, thank you for being here as well. If I was to choose one word to summarize how Washington sees Brazil right now, that word would be relief. Relief that the country survived the challenge, the brush with authoritarianism of the last few years, the possibility of an election being overturned. Just as in the United States, we saw after the election of 2020, we learned things bit by bit in the months afterwards. We've seen a similar process here in Brazil, where we, I think, have grown to appreciate even more just how close we were to some sort of intervention or effort to revert the electoral result last year. And so for the Biden administration, which has spoken of the world being divided between democracies and autocracies, which I do believe is how one of the prisms, perhaps the main prism through which they see global affairs, I think there's a considerable feeling of relief and perhaps, to be honest, even a bit of envy for the way in which legal cases have progressed against former President Bolsonaro, the way in which he has been disqualified from running in, I think it's the next 2 elections, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, that is not a mechanism that exists in the United States Constitution. But in practice, I think that there is an understanding that the Brazilian judicial system moved with a speed that was not possible in the United States, which is why we now face potentially a situation next year in the U.S. of a presidential campaign and multiple criminal trials involving a candidate who has, if I'm not mistaken, 80 felony charges against him, all happening at the same time. And that's a situation that Brazil presumably has managed to already avoid. And so I think there's some admiration for that. Since Lula took office on January 1st, there have been challenges in the U.S.-Brazil relationship, which I think we'll get into over the course of this panel today. But I think there's also a realization that on two of the big issues facing the globe right now, specifically, that's climate change and democracy, that those are areas where Brazil is an important partner and where there are shared values. With the specific question of deforestation in the Amazon, which was such an important issue during the Bolsonaro years, the speed with which deforestation has started, the rate of deforestation has begun to decline again, has surprised everyone, including me. I thought it was going to take quite a long time to reverse the momentum that was seen in favor of deforestation during the Bolsonaro years. No one I know expected the 40% decline, or I think it's even a bit more now that we've seen in deforestation rates so far in 2023. I think in Washington as well as on Wall Street, remembering that I'm based in New York rather than in Washington, so I sort of have dialogue with people, basically the investment community in New York, financial community, as well as people in government, think tanks, and civil society in Washington. I think everyone appreciates and has also been surprised by the stability, relatively speaking, of Lula's approval rate. We live in an era when leaders, not just in Latin America, but all over the West, usually their best day in office is their first day. Yeah. They come in usually having won just barely more than 51% of votes, which was Lula's margin. That's very common. That's what happens in the United States too. And generally what we see is popularity start falling the first day, not just with Joe Biden, to take the U.S. example, but if you look around Latin America, Gabriel Boric, Gustavo Petro, Alberto Fernandez, other leaders, there's this pattern where they come in, they're not able to meet people's expectations, their plurality of support falls, and usually within 6 months, they're at an approval rating of around 30%. That 30% number is what we see again and again and again around the region, and at least so far, Lula has managed to avoid that. I know his popularity is down a little bit in some of the latest polling. Speaking of, we were talking about polling before. If you trust the polls, and on things like popularity, my sense is that they're more or less accurate. He's at 55% right now, which is very strong for a leader anywhere in the world in the year 2023. I think there's also a recognition that Brazil's leadership of the UN Security Council during the month of October, also in capitals around the world, seems to have boosted Brazil's prestige, keeping in mind that this happened during a crisis that may prove to be a turning point in world history with this war that we're now seeing in the Middle East. The fact that happened on Brazil's watch, so to speak. There was a recognition that Lula in particular measured his words and spoke with an equilibrium that perhaps evaded him a bit during the early days of the Ukraine war. There was a real effort to sort of curate his words, the official messages coming out of Itamaraty and elsewhere, that I think was different from some of what we saw in 2020 or in the first part of the year regarding Ukraine. There's also, I wrote about this recently in an article for Revista Piauí that came out last month. There is a common cause, I think, between the individual personalities of Joe Biden and Lula. That appreciation for the importance of organized labor, of unions, the need to create a culture around dignified work in both countries. In the case of the United States, a country that has seen so much erosion in our manufacturing base over the last 30 to 40 years, a conscience of the need to adapt the political economy, the economic policies of the last 30 or 40 years to more directly favor the working class. I know that I've heard that President Biden has spoken passionately and personally about that in his meetings with President Lula in ways that Lula has appreciated. I recently, in that article I wrote for Piauí, I said that Joe Biden is the most petista American president that we've had in probably 50 or 60 years, certainly since LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, and maybe since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There's been recognition of this even amidst sectors of the Workers' Party that historically, let's say, don't align with the United States. I mentioned in the article a tweet by Gleisi Hoffman in 2021 when Biden was pushing through most of his agenda through Congress, and she said something to the effect of, I never thought that I would praise an American president other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but Joe Biden is really reinventing the American economy for the American worker. Now, one can have their doubts about whether those policies will work over time. I certainly do. But if we're talking about sort of the practical and the personal bonds between Biden and Lula, they appear to have been strengthened by the fact that they have this shared agenda. I think President Biden has also, in a world with so many emergencies right now, I think he has managed to make Brazil somewhat of a priority at the right times and say some of the right things. When the two leaders met at the White House back in February, President Biden made a point of telling Lula that he sees Brazil not as a regional power, but as a global power. This was intentional language that was designed to signal to Lula, to Brazil, that they see Brazil, again, despite the fact that there have been these problems, that they see Brazil as a necessary partner on some of these big global issues. But it's a relationship that is changing, that is always volatile. And look, this is in some respects, it's a difficult time to be having this conversation today because the world is changing as we speak. And what we say here in 1 week time or 2 weeks time, it might be a different world. It really might. And I think, and of course, because of the war in the Middle East and the possibility that it might expand and become even more out of control and violent than it is so far. And I do suspect that that war, among other things, will place stress on some of the more positive aspects of the bilateral relationship that I've just described. So we'll talk about that more in a moment, but I do want to sort of back up and say that, all this is happening at what has been a moment of relative optimism regarding Brazil and really most of Latin America. I think we're seeing some good things happen after a decade that was defined by principally by a lack of economic growth or improvement in living standards. The per capita average income in Latin America today is almost exactly what it was in 2013. And we've seen that reflected in the economies all over the region, in politics as well. Part of this phenomenon of presidents who can't stay popular and who can't be reelected is a product of that. A statistic that maybe we quote too much, but I think is worth repeating. Of the last 20 presidential elections in Latin America that were free and fair, so leaving Venezuela and Nicaragua out of it, of the last 20 that were free and fair, the opposition won in 18 of those elections. That's going all the way back to 2018. The only two exceptions were Paraguay, both times. And Paraguay, of course, as you can say, is exceptional in some ways. I think that streak may be broken as soon as 2 weeks from now. There's a possibility that the official government candidate in Argentina might win, so maybe that'll be kind of the end. But the point is, it's been a difficult environment for citizens, most importantly, but also for presidents. But things seem to be looking up, in part because Latin America has what the world needs right now at the end of 2023. It's a region that has the minerals that are necessary for the green energy transition. It has the food and energy that the world needs in the wake of the war in Ukraine, especially Europe, but not just Europe. It has workers that are close to the U.S. market in an era of nearshoring and the reorganization of supply chains following the pandemic, and also growing tensions between Washington and Beijing. And partly as a result, Brazil and Mexico are expected to both grow more than 3% this year in GDP. That's important. That will contribute to a regional economy that's supposed to grow 2.3% according to the latest forecast of the IMF. That's not, it's not a great number, but if you consider that the average, and I'll stop with the numbers here in a second, I promise, but the average between 2015 and 2019 in Latin America, the average growth was 0.9%. So compared to that, 2.3 feels pretty good. And the two biggest countries in the region, Brazil and Mexico, are doing even better than that. And that's part of the reason why our latest issue of America's Quarterly, which I brought here, is a relatively bullish case for Latin America, in part because of these positive trends that we're seeing in a region that's feeling somewhat better today for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons for that has to do with foreign policy and kind of the way that these countries are aligning themselves. What some people call neutrality or active non-alignment, to take the term that's currently in vogue. But, it's not a new idea. Feliciano mentioned the book that I wrote with former President Cardozo. I asked him years ago, this was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I asked him, what he thinks Brazil should be doing about this growing strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing. And he thinks for a moment. He says, I think we have to take advantage of one of Brazil's greatest strategic assets, which is that Brazil is far. O Brasil é longe. And what he meant, of course, was that it is distant from these hot spots. And of course, this was before Ukraine. This was before the Middle East. But what he said resonates in the current context. Brazil has the luxury of having a certain geographical distance and geopolitical distance from some of these trouble spots in the world. And, that's without even thinking about what could potentially happen in Taiwan in the next couple of years. And so in that context, it makes sense, at least in the short term, for Brazil and other countries in the region to very carefully align themselves somewhere in the middle, to try to occupy some kind of middle ground. And, there's all kinds of misconceptions about this in the United States. Marco Rubio, the Republican senator from Florida, has frequently has said that the countries in Latin America that are trying to occupy middle ground, they're communists. And first of all, I'm not sure I guess the only communist leader in the region really is Diaz-Canel in Cuba. But it's not even a left versus right question. This is what people, I think, in Washington sometimes fail to understand, even though the facts are staring them right in the face. Because the most enthusiastic proponents of engagement with China in Latin America over the last 5 years have been people like Sebastián Piñera, Guillermo Lasso, Iván Duque, and others, all of whom made state visits to Beijing because they understand how important China is to their economies. And what I hear, and I've been in Brazil, I arrived yesterday, but had some meetings in Sao Paulo, and I hear across the ideological spectrum here, as well as in other capitals around Latin America, support for that non-aligned posture. Now, I am understanding of moral arguments that get made against that posture. I'm also personally sensitive to the view that it might not be a sustainable posture over the time if the world really does split in two in the event, for example, of a war with Taiwan. It's reasonable to think that at that point it might actually be necessary to take sides. But we're not there yet. And so I understand why this posture has been adopted by governments on left, center, and right all over the region. I think the Biden administration understands this too. And they make a point in conversations I have with officials in Washington. They understand that Latin America has to trade with China and that it has to cultivate that relationship. They also, this government seems to understand better than previous governments that on this question of strategic positioning, there is nothing less effective than an American standing on a stage and wagging his or her finger at a Latin American audience, telling them that China is bad. Because it sounds like the American interest. It doesn't sound like they're speaking in the interest of their audience. Is there a case to be made for more alignment with the United States? Yes, but historically it hasn't been made effectively by American voices, especially at a moment where there's this perception that Washington doesn't have much to offer in return. Because we live in an era where neither party in Washington, for the first time since World War II, neither party fundamentally believes in free trade. The U.S. is unable to order its companies to invest for geopolitical reasons in the way that China can do that. The U.S. can't. And so it leaves the U.S. without many forms of engagement when it comes to offering an alternative. And this is the question that U.S. officials get all the time. Okay, what are you offering? And in an era, again, where those things are true, where budgets are tight because the economy, has had some problems in the wake of the pandemic, there's, at least so far, Washington has not been able to come up with a compelling answer to that question. Just finally, before we move on to Fernanda, a couple of thoughts on the bilateral relationship. There have been ups and downs since Lula took office. Ukraine and Russia, that whole question was a turbulent time. Especially Lula's comments. There were really two comments that people still talk about. One, Lula on several occasions said that Zelensky and Putin had equal shares of responsibility for the Ukraine war. But the comment that really bothered people was when Lula was in China and he said that the continuation of the war was, above all, sobretudo, the fault of the U.S. and Europe for providing arms. That's a that's a comment that I think a lot of people have not forgotten. And, I guess beyond people's personal feelings, I think it made people understand that Lula was not going to be this powerful voice at a regional or a global level in favor of democracy, at least in the view of the United States. When you combine what he said during those months with what he said about Venezuela, for example, standing at a podium in Brasilia, having extended a welcome to Nicolas Maduro akin to a state visit, and saying that the only problem in Venezuela was a problem of narrative. I think there was an understanding at that point that Lula was a valuable partner, is a valuable partner in many areas, but that the hopes that some people in Washington had that this leader who had, defeated Bolsonaro and helped protect Brazilian democracy would be a compelling voice for democracy in the region and in the world. I think those hopes vanished after that period. And I think there's a view now, to use a phrase that I've said a couple times in the press, I think there's an understanding that Brazil is more of a partner than an ally. That it's a country with which the United States can work on big strategic questions of the day, like climate change, but not an automatic ally. Or automatic is the wrong word. Not a reliable ally in the traditional sense of the word. But, again, I think some of that has improved over the last couple of months. I think everybody has digested on both sides. I think that both sides have digested and learned to live side by side with that understanding that that's the way it's going to be. The question mark now is what will happen to the relationship now with the conflict in the Middle East. What happened with the resolution in the UN Security Council was dramatic. I think we can talk about that maybe in the question and answer part. But if you believe that that conflict is likely to get worse and that pressure over civilian deaths is likely to grow louder, and that Brazil in particular will be a voice not only for Latin America but for the global South, which seems to be very clearly leaning towards the Palestinian view. There's reason to believe that this relationship that we were talking about, that has had its ups and downs, will come under increased stress in the months to come. So with those initial remarks, I can't wait to hear Fernanda and some of your questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for your remarks. Now I'll pass the word to Fernanda, but I would like to remind everyone, between the people online on YouTube and Zoom and the people in the audience, we have more than 100 people with us. Fernanda will do her remarks, and then we will open for the audience for Q&A. For those who are online, please just write down the questions in English here in the chat, and I will select those questions for the audience. Professor Fernanda Magnota, you have the floor. Thank you for being here with us again.
Thank you, Feliciano. Thank you, Pedro and CEBRI, for putting this together. It is a pleasure, Brian, to be here with you. I'm very happy that it was possible to make it work. And I'm even, I would say, happier because I'm in Rio, the most beautiful city in the country. So it's very good to see friends in this very special place. So welcome back. And I'm very happy that we can have this conversation. I probably have been talking to the same people as you did because I've been listening very similar things. Some of them you already described, but I'll try to make an alternative view just to guarantee that we have here a conversation. And since you selected a word to start your presentation, I'll do the same. But you selected relief to describe the relationship. I would select ambiguity. I think ambiguity is a very good word to describe what we are having right now, because depending on who you talk to in Washington, you find very different views about what you're feeling about Brazil and the Brazilian foreign policy at this moment. I say that because I can identify in this process. I've been interviewing people in DC for the last months because I was in a Fulbright project, first about U.S., China, Latin America, Brazil, of course, relations, and also because it's part of my, I don't know, forever. So here what I'll try to express is not exactly what I think, but the perception I have of their perception. So this is the idea. And I can see two very strong and different narratives. The first one is, of course, the official one. It is similar in the Brazilian side and the American side. They also express a very optimistic point of view regarding the bilateral relations. When you ask them about how they analyze the achievements, they are very positive. They say that the moment is very special. They try to convince us all that there are lots of convergences coming and going. And also, you described something that I heard as well, that reports of, I would say, intimacy between the two leaders, even considering the last meeting in New York City. I had the opportunity to hear about how it was during the meeting, and everybody I talked to who were there in the meeting described as a very natural and good situation in which they could share genuine values that they have in common, etc. So this is the first narrative, the official one. But there is also a second narrative that is very strong in Washington as well, that is a little bit more, I would say, skeptical about the bilateral relation. This is the back channel one. So the back channel one is full of suspicion, is full of is resentful, I would say. And and people, high officials, are bothered sometimes about the way Brazil behaves. So I say resentful because what I heard in many times was that the Americans, they had an expectation that since they backed the Brazilian election somehow, even in the discourse, in the speech level, President Biden was the first one to recognize the Brazilian election results. When we had the chance to elect our president, it was like 35 minutes later than the official results were announced. Of course, we all remember the lots of very high-level visits that happened in Brazil before the election during President Bolsonaro administration. So from the military, from many other places. So part of this resentment I'm referring to is that for some Americans in the government, the expectation was, okay, we helped you to make it work, to overcome this challenge. And now that you are there, you are in power, we would expect that we could be more than partners. Maybe we could be allies. So this is a very strong, very, very strong, as you know, narrative in some of the headquarters in Washington. And of course, a very complex relationship as this one is full of convergences and divergences. This is normal. I would say that you listed the most important ones. So when we talk about the convergencies, there are three that, of course, are the most prominent and important: democracy and the shared values that we all have, and the way we see institutions, the necessity of doing things that make them better, environmental issues, and minority rights. So these are the three most relevant topics that probably are part of the convergency. Even the more skeptical, they would agree that we're trying to do the best we can in this three agenda. But I see, especially in the more critical group, Ukraine, as you said, BRICS Plus, especially considering Iran, and some speeches or opinions that were made public by the presidency of Brazil, not just regarding Venezuela and their narrative thing that you mentioned, but also regarding ICC, for the Brazilian audience, TPI. So I see that it's been very difficult to overcome that. Even when President goes back and tries to explain himself, there are lots of people in Washington, D.C. that are not convinced they can trust Brazil. This is, I'm just following up here what I've been hearing for a long time. So considering that as a disclaimer, what I see and what now I am analyzing, this is the way I elaborate on that, is that at the same time, it's comprehensive and we can understand why Americans react this way, especially the more skeptical group. At the same time, it's very complicated for us in the Latin American side to accommodate this vision, especially the more negative vision of our foreign policy. And I need to say that we are a very polarized country. We are not a place in which convergences have been made in a very easy way. Here in this room, probably we have many people that probably can like or dislike the government. It's not about defending the Brazilian government or criticizing the Brazilian government. It's thinking about what is in mind of the Brazilian decision makers when they try to shape this agenda. So I'm saying that because as a reaction of this way of explaining things, I would say that first, for Brazil and in the Brazilian perspective, it still sounds that the U.S. has no strategy for Latin America. That this is very important for us. I remember when National Security Strategy, the last one, when it was released and it was possible to analyze the document. We were very optimistic because in the introduction section, they were mentioning Latin America in a very enthusiastic way, saying, so this is a very strategic area in the world, this is a place in which the U.S. must pay attention to, etc. And Feliciano can confirm that, but the Brazilians here, we were like, it's coming. The strategy now is coming. And then suddenly the region disappears of the document. During the whole document, there is no mention of the area. And we say like, the U.S. forgot us. And this is a dilemma, as you know, in Brazil, because sometimes we really want that the U.S. remember us. And sometimes we really want the U.S. to forget us. We're not very confident on what we prefer, but I think there is a lack of strategy in terms of what to do with the region. And it's also connected to, I will use a very strong word, but it's on purpose. So you in the audience, don't kill me. Yeah, you know, I'm a professor. I need to do things for people to pay attention to me. So, at the same time, we have a lack of strategy. I would say that sometimes for our perception, the American audience, the American officials, they are kind of oriented by guardianship. And this is a problem. Yes, yes, because you know, in international relations, saying that is a thing. But why am I saying that? Because sometimes when I talk to Americans about how they react to the Brazilian decisions, I see that there is a very binary vision of things, and this binary vision of things. It's a complicated framework because it does not recognize the legitimacy of the Brazil's agent's power. It always considers as an assumption that the Brazilians are not seeing the challenges coming, that the Americans need to explain to the Brazilians the risks that are in the long run. This is very present. And sometimes it is also very complicated to explain to the American officials that we share lots of things, and that's why the relationship is stable, important, strategic. Everybody knows that. But we don't share the same geopolitical views and the same geopolitical challenges, and not just because we don't have the same stock of power, but also because we don't have the same priority agendas. So it's not possible to consider as an assumption that Brazil and the US are reading and behaving in the world by the same point of view, because they're not. So every time the Americans try to describe the Brazilian action, considering that the common rival is China, for example, this is wrong, because it may fit the American version of how to do this framework. It's okay by the American version to see and understand and describe and act in the world by this vision, but it's not describing what is for the other actors, such as Brazil. So I'm saying that because you talked about this non-alignment view, or the idea that the Brazilian diplomacy now is seeking for a more diverse, multipolar, whatever world. And sometimes I think it's precisely this point that causes the ambiguity. Because the Americans, they say that they recognize Brazil as a great power or emerging power or a BRICS or whatever. But when Brazil tries to behave as an actor with that characteristics, the reaction is really bad. And it comes the guardianship idea, and it comes the idea of a country that is doing things not because there is a rationality that exists. We can agree or not on that. This is a discussion. I've been very critic to the decisions this government made, and I wrote lots of pieces on that. So everybody knows my specific position on this matter. But at the same time, you need to recognize there is a legitimacy and there is a rationality there. Comprehensive. Okay. And I think this is still the problem. So my short comment and my point here as a provocation, I know you share part of the same dilemmas I am describing here. I recommend a lot if you didn't read what Brian wrote about anti-Americanism. I really recommend, because I'm saying that knowing what you think about, but I think that this was a great opportunity to Brazil and to the U.S. to put together a very long run and strong and relevant strategy. We have two governments with the same agenda in some issues. They are very similar, as you said, in many, many, many issues. And to be very, very sincere, I think this ambiguity and these noises, they are so strong that we have at this moment more promises and discourses and handshakings and pictures than actually action. I don't see action. Even considering the trips, even considering the documents signed, I need to give you just an example. I've been discussing to many, many Brazilian and American diplomats about what was signed between U.S. and Brazil during the New York meeting, the labor's document. And of course, it is a gesture, and gestures are very important in international relations. We appreciate that. Of course, we are all in the same page about the importance of the matter, but all the diplomats I talked to, they asked me the same question, and it was genuine. They were waiting for an answer. Did you understand what are the outcomes? Because we saw like a memorandum in which we share principles and we agree on general ideas, but what's gonna happen? What's next? And this is just one example. So I know Halloween was yesterday, not today, and I don't want to be the pessimistic here, but I'm trying to make some provocations just to, open the floor so we can discuss. And I would really appreciate if you could comment during the Q&A session or later about your feelings, your views on what I'm describing. So to sum up, I'm describing a more pessimistic point of view. I'm describing a more, some would say, realistic in terms of the outcomes in the sense, and a very worried point of view of someone that, of course, would like to have a relationship and seeing the relationship going further. But I can't imagine what's coming next, because if during these two governments that have lots in common, we are not making it work as we could, can you imagine what's coming next? And I'll give you the chance to think about that, because if Joe Biden is reelected, okay, it's more of what we know. It's more time to maybe put this strategy together. But if we have a change in the American political system, what at this point is reasonable, if President Trump is reelected, for example, what's going to happen? What's going to be? So sometimes I'm as worried as you are in terms of how Iran, Israel, Ukraine, China would affect the bilateral relationship. And sometimes I ask myself how domestic change will affect that. So if we're not able to do this job now, is it still in the discourse level? Imagine in a different, less favorable situation. So I'll stop here because, I've been talking a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you very much for the provocations. They're very good ones. For some reason, you guys disappeared to me, but I think you guys can hear me, correct?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you. So we received a number of questions here in the Q&A, and I'm sure Brian wants to react to Fernanda's comments. So I'm just going to pose a couple of them. I think one that I was going to pose, and I think at the end of Fernanda's words is about that, which is what would happen to this bilateral relationship, and also the perception, American perception about Brazil if Trump is elected next year. If you could elaborate a little bit on that, what's your view of that? Many other questions. Another question that we received from that question that I mentioned came from Mr. Cássio Casagrande. Another question that I received from Professor Eduardo Viola, a good friend of ours here at CEBRI. He said, I think we can divide the views about Brazil in the United States in 5 different segments. The centrist Democrats, the left of the Democratic Party, the minoritarian moderate Republicans, and the Trumpists, the MAGA majority of the Republicans, and also the global corporations. Do you think that this classification is correct? And if so, could you elaborate a little bit more on those different perceptions, if possible? So I will start with these 2 questions, and also we have people in the audience in Rio. So I think Pedro or someone else will have the mic there, but after we can open to Rio after Brian's reaction. So Brian, please, you have the floor.
So so if anyone here in person wants to ask a question, just raise their hand. We'll put them in the line. So Bruno, yeah.
Are you going to collect to the questions now from the audience there?
Yeah, probably, Feliciano, we can, a suggestion, we can have one more question here, and then Brian answers in a row, and then we go for a second row, okay?
Okay, go ahead.
So, thank you very much, Brian and Fernanda. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Pedro. Feliciano, although he's behind me and I can't see him, but I like this one-word or two-word description. So for many years, I have heard of the relationship being described as cautious optimism. And I think we're probably still in that boat. So the question is, this lack of alignment in foreign policy, are the 2 countries really able to build a clear strategic vision for this relationship, considering the polarization that's occurring in both countries?
So to start, my neck hurts from nodding so much during your remarks because but this is the thing, right? Like, I don't think that our respective messages actually contradicted each other so much, because it actually does depend on who you talk to. And the question about the 5 groups, it's true. I mean, we're sitting here trying to talk about gigantic bureaucracies with multiple parties and kind of what they say and think about each other. And that's hard. I mean, to say that Washington thinks this or Brasilia thinks that, I mean, anyone who, I was a political journalist for 15 years. I'm more a political analyst now, and trying to sort of synthesize that is always difficult, but it's what we do. And I think that so much of what you said, I mean, I've heard certainly some of those same misgivings about Brazil and tried to write about them. The article that you're referring to in America's Quarterly, the headline, the provocative headline was, "Is Lula anti-American?" And I won't repeat sort of my answer to that here because I want to react more to what you said and sort of part of the audience. But actually, I'm going to use a line that I think I used in that article, which is that it is true that for a lot of people in Washington, a large, confident Latin American nation acting in its own national interest, as opposed to being automatically aligned or automatically opposing Washington, does not compute. It's not true of everybody, but there is a historic difficulty in understanding that. And to your point, you can sometimes have conversations with people where you say that, they're like, no, I get it. Oh, yeah, no, I understand Brazil. But then when it comes down to like a specific issue and a specific action, it all kind of falls apart. And people grasp their heads and say, gosh, why are they acting this way? In ways that are sometimes, what was the word? Guardianship. Yeah, I mean, this idea that because the United States, the Biden administration, intervened in active ways, not to help a candidate, but to try to protect Brazilian institutions, Brazil's elections, Brazilian democracy, the idea that somehow would then, that there would be a payoff at the end of that with like a closer alignment seems to me like a 20th century idea as opposed to a 21st century idea. But it reflects, again, that muscle memory. And some of this, look, there are many really good people in Washington who I think work with Latin America. It's not a large community. I mean, we're talking about maybe 24 people when it's all said and done. Some of them are modern, very forward-looking. And some of them, we're all sort of, and to get very personal and sort of philosophical here, we're all products of the era in which we came of age and received our intellectual formation and where we were during those years. My formation, I was in South America, in Brazil, in Argentina during the 2000s. That was when I was first getting started. And so that was a good time. That was a time when democracies were growing, when economies were growing. And so this optimism that I have is sometimes, I feel like, a product of that era. And so I find myself sometimes having to question whether that is the right framework. If you're an American official of a certain age who started working with the region in the 1980s or the 1990s, very different moments, then I think that you're going to go back, whether you sort of can resist it or not, you're going to go back to that you're either with us or you're against us model that is the framework for so much thinking about Latin America. That said, if we take the two main conflict points that I talked about in my remarks and sort of put them through that lens, it's not really part of necessarily Brazil acting in an independent way. The comments on Ukraine struck many people as leaning pro-Moscow. And so that's a different dynamic. And the comments about Venezuela were indefensible. That was not Brazil's, national, I don't think. I mean, I think rather than, that was not Brazil's national interest talking. My interpretation, my personal interpretation, is that was Lula himself being the product of a certain era, not being able to criticize and describe Venezuela for being the nasty dictatorship that it is today. Because he sees, I think, again, as someone who's tried to understand and follow Lula for 20 years and respects Lula and in many ways admires Lula, my interpretation is that he sees the world through the lens of class struggle first. And because he has historically sympathized with the Chavista point of view, he is unable to criticize Maduro when he's standing there by his side. It's my personal interpretation. So that's not an issue of Washington somehow failing to understand what the Brazilian interest is. I think it's other dynamics at work. And then finally, this lack of an agenda. It's an issue. And I think that, there could be more imagination and more creativity when it comes to these questions. But there's this perpetual question of, like, what should the U.S. and Brazil be doing together? People will complain and say, complain is too negative a word, because I think a lot of the times it's in good faith and it comes from a good place. But the U.S. doesn't have an agenda. There's no substance to some of these agreements. But then when you turn that question around, you say, okay, what do you think these countries should be doing? Typically, I don't hear a lot of answers. And I remember a very specific moment you talk about our domestic politics, when Bolsonaro and Trump were both in office. We had one of those moments where there was all the boa vontade on both sides to kind of do things together. And not much happened. Even though there was I remember, some of the personalities and the ambassadors involved, there was all these conversations. Finally, we're aligned, we think the same thing, and maybe a little too automatic on the Brazilian, on the Brazilian side in particular, kind of a 20th century style desire to please and to ally and to kind of give Washington what it wanted. And, as I recall, permission to use Alcantara, and some work on the trade front, but nothing really, because the Trump administration didn't really believe in trade, just as the Biden administration doesn't really believe in trade. And so not much happened. So I don't know how much of that is a failure of imagination on the part of policymakers, how much of it is U.S. and Brazilian interests and profiles at the end of the day just not aligning in a way that it makes sense to do a whole lot more right now, and how much of it is just sort of the domestic political conditions in each country making trade, for example, impossible. Finally, just the question from, was it from the it was the what happens if Trump wins question, right? It was from Casio, I think. It's from everybody. Look, I honestly, I don't know. And part of the reason I don't know is because Lula and George W. Bush had a pretty good relationship. And not only that, but when Trump was in office, I'm sure everyone here rightly focused on the Trump-Bolsonaro relationship, but there were others around Latin America that seemed like they were going to be very difficult. It seemed like when Trump was elected, like it was going to be potentially a very difficult time. But governments around the region understood eventually, some of them pretty quickly, that Trump's style of foreign policy was transactional in nature, and that as long as they worked with the United States on the one or two issues that Trump believed was important, that things would more or less run smoothly. And I think in our electoral system, if Trump is indeed the Republican candidate, which it seems like he will be, in a two-party system and in a polarized country like ours, his odds of victory will be somewhere around 50%, maybe a bit less, but not much less, maybe a bit more. I don't know at this point, just in part because of what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in our economy and inflation and everything else. It's not favorable to Biden, but I'm not sure that it would be a disaster in terms of the bilateral relationship. I do know that if people think that the Biden administration has vestiges of this binary, you're either with us or you're against us thinking, they may have saudades for Biden if Trump gets elected, because I think that philosophy, that way of thinking about Latin America tends to be more present, I think it's fair to say, in Republican foreign policy circles than Democratic ones.
No, thank you very much for your comment. I would like just to mention that I can't imagine how it would be to manage the reaction in DC if Trump was the president and President Lula in China had said something like de-dollarization and about the way Brazil wants to align to the Chinese in strategic areas such as technology, innovation, etc., etc. So I agree on you that if it's binary now, it could be worse. And I think it's very related to the question that she made here in the audience that is related to the dilemmas, both of them, these leaderships, they have domestically. They are trying to manage what they consider a priority and survive politically inside the country. It's been more important than other issues. And I think for us that are interested in international affairs, it's been a very interesting moment because in a long time we couldn't see international affairs so connected to domestic issues, and they are very connected. Even when they are part of the building of a narrative, whatever, it's still very important. For example, I'll give you an example. Days ago, I had a chance to discuss with officials, American officials about Chinese technology in Latin America. And it was very, very, very difficult to explain to them that for some leaders in the region, buying technology from the Chinese, it is not a matter of surveillance, of civil rights, or democracy, lack of democracy, and all the challenges that generally comes with this kind of discussion. It is about security, like domestic security, crime. Exactly. It is connected to a very important agenda for many places in the region. So you cannot disattach the discussion of public security in the region and, you know, cyber, whatever, surveillance and democracy. So there are layers in this discussion of the bilateral relations that are very complex. And if we consider China as a triangle on that, I think it can be even worse in the future. So it's just a comment adding on what you said, but agreeing on you.
Thank you, Brian, Fernanda. I have many other questions here from the audience. I think there are two issues here that are appearing in many questions. The first is something that Brian mentioned in his first presentation, which is how important is going to be this current situation in Israel and Palestine to the bilateral relationship between the two countries, right? We have Henrique Rezinski made a questions to this regard. Who else? André Masuku as well, and many others here. So I myself, for example, when I saw that Brazil was going to put forward the resolution to a vote at the Security Council, I was like uneasy with that. I knew that Brazil was doing the right thing to try to put the resolution together. I think all the arguments that the Brazilian diplomacy was using to put the resolution together were fair and were very good. But I was not sure that the resolution to a vote that would automatically force the U.S. veto was the best strategy for the bilateral relationship. I'm not talking specific about the situation there in the conflict, but I think it's an example of how that so intricate and complicated conflict can affect the bilateral relationship between Brazil and the United States. So this is one side of the question. But in a more positive side, there are three questions about U.S. perception on Brazil's ecological transition program, which is a program launched recently by Minister Fernando Haddad that was supported by President Lula, which is it's somewhat inspired by the Inflation Reduction Act of the Biden administration. it's one of these positives of the bilateral relationship. If Brian could elaborate a little bit more on that, would be important. And so who asked about that? Felipe Silva asked about this issue. Wells, yeah, and other people here. Sometimes people don't write their names on. So,
And
Brian,
Feliciano,
back to you. If there's more questions there, please go
yeah, I
ahead.
think we have 2 people with questions here.
Thank you very much for the presentations, very enlightening indeed. And I wanted to pose a question to Brian regarding how do you see the relation between the presidential mandates affecting this relationship? Because we see now that Biden is running for re-election, while Lula is beginning his first term. So we can probably argue that there is an agenda setting in this program, because Biden is in need to show some results, while Lula is perhaps trying to put forward an agenda. And this different timing, do you think that this is a problem? And how does it affect the bilateral relationship? And also, we've discussed some scenarios and consequences of Trump's re-elections, but I would like to hear something on a more positive note. If he's not re-elected, what do you think will come to the agenda, and what scenarios will you put forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, Fernanda, for your excellent debate. Very engaging, and I was reminded during your talks about I am a CEBRI Journal's editorial coordinator. My name is Bruno, and our editors Feliciano and Hussein have published a policy paper about the hedging, a traditional hedging in Brazilian foreign policy that they suggest is ideal to be renewed and be adopted in full, especially regarding US and China in the global context. So in light of what Fernanda described about the resent and suspicion, feelings of suspicion and resent that might exist, would you comment about is this hedging policy ideal in light of how the US sees Brazil? I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Bruno.
Let's talk a little bit about what happened at the UN, right? Because we haven't really gotten into it yet. And, you know, my sense, that was a day. Some days are days, and some days seem like months, and some days seem like years. And that day was like a year, right? I mean, Biden was on the ground in Israel that day. Brazil was trying to push this motion through the Security Council. And I have to also say, I'm not completely clear, in part because it was so much was happening on what the exact sequence of events was. But what I heard afterward was, I think, what has been in the press and what we all understand, which is the U.S. view was that with Biden on the ground in Israel, that trying to make his own diplomatic efforts in favor of getting humanitarian aid into Gaza, trying to negotiate for the release of the prisoners taken by Hamas, that the White House didn't want to do anything that might upset that delicate balance. And therefore, from what I understand, that was the reason why they vetoed it. That's kind of, I don't know. I mean, I understand that. I think that it's true in practice that having a U.S. president on the ground, I mean, I'm not sure here, it was the first time a U.S. president had been in an active war zone since, I guess, well, no, I mean, presidents had been on the ground during the Iraq War, for example, and had been to Afghanistan, excuse me, but some water here. It was risky, I think, both politically and in terms of security. And so a U.S. president with the relationship that the U.S. has with Israel, despite the very personal problems between Netanyahu and Biden specifically, I think there was a lot that we could have expected from that day, and some progress ended up being made. The problem is, from the Brazilian perspective, was that the resolution itself seemed very carefully calibrated, and the U.S. decision to veto because of Biden being on the ground felt unipolar. Right. It felt reflective of this belief that only the United States can help, only we can do this. And I what I'm trying to sort of transmit here is I'm sympathetic to kind of both points of view on this one, because in practice, as much as we don't want to, like sitting here in Brazil, the idea that the U.S. could have done a lot in that moment seems unfashionable, but I think it has a truth to it. And I also understand the Brazilian perspective, from the perspective of the rest of global public opinion was effectively lined up behind that resolution. Brazil is, along with other countries, is trying to use the UN as a more important voice in a more important space at this moment, which also seems valuable. So it was unfortunate what happened. I don't know if you have anything to add on this.
Yeah, I think you.
Fernando, sorry, both of you, do you think that this final decision of Brazil to put the resolution to a vote might affect the bilateral relationship between the United States and Brazil? Because can the Americans react negatively or retaliate Brazil somewhat?
Look,
that's what is one of my concerns. I'm sorry to interrupt here.
No. Look, I'm going to confess sort of here what I don't know, which is that I have not spoken to very high U.S. officials about their reaction to this. So I'm speculating, and I'll be brief on this. But what I sense is, again, this view that, yeah, it was unfortunate what happened the way it did, and let's also recognize that in the 2 weeks or 20 years, since this happened, the U.S. position in public actually sounds a lot more like the Brazilian position and the language of that resolution did then. The Biden administration is more actively calling for protection of citizens, humanitarian aid, and so on. So I think perhaps, Feliciano, though, to your point, there is... Look, as I said at the beginning, all this is moving so quickly. The global South really does seem more aligned at this point with the Palestinians. That's my sense. I don't know if I'd be curious to know whether you agree, but that's sort of the cleavages that are forming. It seems to be in that direction, and so this is clearly a government, the Lula government, that is positioning itself as a leader of the global South. I think BRICS and BRICS expansion and other declarations speak to that. And so while there may not be a lot of malestar over what happened at the UN 2 weeks ago, I think there is an awareness, I sense that there is an awareness that those divergences are probably likely to become even greater if this conflict worsens the way that a lot of people expect it to.
Yeah, just two very brief comments. The first one is exactly what you just said. I think it's more something related to timing than substance in this case. And I think it reflects lots of perceptions of people working on that matter. So it was not about being unipolar exactly. It sounded like it was analyzed as if it was, but it can be described as a timing thing. So we can work on that Let's assume that. But the second thing that I would like to mention is that it is very important to remember and put in a broader context this specific decision at the UN and what's related to the Middle East situation, but considering that weeks before, when we, of course, didn't have the situation happening in the Middle East, but when the Global South was meeting in South Africa, what I heard from many people in the US was, and now I quote, "You see, the Brazilians and some other partners in the BRICS, they were imagining that all of them were in the same page, they had the same agenda, they were willing for the same future, but then they realized during the BRICS meeting that actually it was a Chinese meeting, and the Chinese set up the agenda, and they were, you know, taking to what the Chinese had already decided." So now we go back to the UN situation weeks later in a very different world, in a very complicated, specific context. But how, from our point of view, we should react on that? Like, weeks ago, you told us that they were not reliable. And during the BRICS meeting, the Brazilian diplomacy should not be very confident that they could go together with the Chinese, because the Chinese, they would define the future in their own terms without considering us. And weeks later, we together as partners in the UN feeling exactly the same thing again, but with the Americans. So it's just a comment, of course, full of differences besides the two contexts and both situations, but to share this perception that that's why the Brazilian interest is not the American interest and it's not the Chinese interest. It is and it has to be the Brazilian interest, because when you rely on someone else, doesn't matter if it's the Americans or the Chinese, you're going to be alone. That's the message for us.
Well, and I look, I mean, perhaps maybe another way of saying this is hegemons will behave like hegemons, whether it's Beijing or Washington. And to me, this belief, and it's my own personal view, sometimes the sympathy that you hear toward Beijing in places like Brasilia seems rooted in the belief that China will be a better hegemon than the United States was. The example that you cited, and we'll see what the coming decades bring. But that's an open question. There were other questions about the ecological transition program and the U.S. perception. To be honest, I have not heard much, and I think that's partly a function of the fact that the world has gone crazy. And I have a similar, actually, answer for the question about, will this all, the electoral calendar and the kind of the alignment of presidential and political cycles between the United States and Brazil somehow impact the bilateral relationship? I think that there are so many, I think two regional wars, both with possibility of escalation and potentially nuclear escalation with great powers getting involved. I think people's plates are full. And, one consequence of the current moment is that, if we thought that not much bandwidth was being given to Latin America before, now Ukraine, we heard once the Ukraine war started that there was just not that much time at the senior most level for thinking about the region in a way that, by the way, I agree is a mistake, because I think that so many of the shared challenges could be addressed through greater hemispheric integration, for lack of a better term. But I mean, this is a scary moment in world history right now, and I meant what I said at the beginning, which is that in 2 weeks' time, the world could look a lot different than it does right now, if Iran directly gets involved in this war. So, it occurs to me that some of these questions about the U.S. not paying enough attention, I think we're going to hear that question even more, unfortunately, if these wars continue to get worse. On that happy note, are there any?
Do we have more
only,
questions in
2
the
minutes
audience?
left.
Sorry, Feliciano, please, over to you.
No, we're just saying that we have only 2 minutes left. There is, I have 15 more questions here. I don't think we have time to answer any of those, but
Maybe some final
I-
remarks, right? Just
Yeah,
to
the
wrap
problem
up.
is that we don't have the answers. It doesn't matter. You have the questions. We
that's
have
the
no
point.
idea.
yeah. So I think I give the word back to Fernanda for her final remarks, and then Brian, and then we wrap up from there. Fernanda, please go ahead.
Yes, I just would like to thank you so much for your patience and for your participation during this panel. It was a pleasure to have Brian you here. It is very good to read you and to listen to you now in person here. I hope everybody had a chance to read what he's been writing. Americans Quarterly, sure, and this specific article I've been mentioning here, but also POE's new edition. So I encourage you all to read that. And of course, I am playing a role here just to make sure that we have a very nice discussion, considering that we are in the next days having holidays in Brazil. So I want everybody very happy here. So thank you so much, Brian, for your time, and I also congratulate you all for putting this event together. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you for the participation.
I would just close by saying how much I know everybody here appreciates this space. I mean, this is what CEBRI does is so important, so unique in the Brazilian context, to be able to have, in an era of tweets, or whatever they're called now, X, I guess, to be able to have these longer conversations where we could really explore these themes with some depth and, find convergences and talk some of these things out. It's not something that we should take for granted. I mean, it really is rare to have this kind of opportunity. And so I'm very grateful to CEBRI and to Fernanda and Pedro and Feliciano and all of you for being here in person, people who were here online. I learned a lot. Like I said, my neck hurts from nodding so much during Fernanda's remarks. And congratulations for the work you do, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. Tchau, pessoal. Até mais.
Thank you, guys. See you next time.
Tchau.